Professor after many years in the Faculty of Law at UNSW, where he served as Dean. He is now an Emeritus Professor of both UTS and UNSW. His principal research interests are in corporate and securities law, corporate governance, and corporate responsibility. His current focus is on reforms that might make a reality of soft law frameworks that assert the responsibility of business to protect human rights, and global soft law standards of responsible conduct. He also has a particular interest in legal education and has been involved in several national and international reviews of programs and structures. He was the founding faculty co-director of the Brennan program from 2011 until mid-2020. The program seeks to inspire law students to develop their innate sense of justice and to make the world a better place for the exercise of their rich talents as students and in the years to come. He thinks that understanding the journey of justice requires a lifetime's reflection and hopes that today's webinar helps you on that journey. I'd now like to introduce you to Paul Redmond. I'm just going to share the slides, Paul.
Thank you.
If I can. Okay, how's that?
That's terrific. Thank you. Thank you, Mac. And am I coming through clearly?
Yeah, very clear.
Excellent, excellent. Look, and thank you for that lovely welcome, Mac, and for the invitation to talk to students today. I'm grateful to the students for turning up and for this discussion. Mac, could we go on to the, to the next slide if you don't mind? I want to talk about the structure of today, what the purpose is. The idea of justice, what we mean by justice, understanding the concept of justice is really central to being a law student. It's central to the Brennan program. There are these two limbs to the program. And for those who are new to the program, I particularly welcome you into the program. It's really one of the great treats of actually coming to UTS Law School, that you get to be part of this program and the richness that it offers. If you were in medical school, one of the things that would, the background noise would always be about health, whether individual health or public health. In a law school, the background concern is always about justice, law's connection to justice, whether law is achieving justice. But what do we mean by justice? Justice is a concept that isn't something you get out of a textbook. There are many different understandings of justice, many different ideas of justice. And in a sense that thinking about justice, reflecting on it, is a lifetime's work. It's a lifetime's idea, particularly for lawyers, for who have responsibility as custodians for the notion of justice. And I just wanted today to introduce some of those conceptions of justice and start you thinking and start you moving down the path of that, that long reflection, a path that of course you would have begun already, but it helps just to think about what do we mean when we try to act justly as an individual and as a society. And the structure for doing that, I thought, would be to start with this lovely hypothetical from the great developmental economist Amartya Sen on the idea of justice in his book with that title, I should say. I want to start with that hypothetical in just a moment. But then the structure would be, okay, I'd like just to invite you to nominate. We don't really have time to discuss them today, but some issues of justice, particularly going to justice at a wider societal level that you think are really important. Let's just list some that that stay with you, that are important to you. And then I want to go through these different notions of justice rather quickly. So that all I can do is introduce them, but to start you on the way and give you some resources that might be useful in your own journey to reflect upon justice. And then we might come back to the flute hypothetical and say, okay, how do we apply those notions? How do we resolve the question that I'm going to give you that's on the screen in front of you? Who would you, as the judicial figure, the decision maker, whom would you give this flute to between these three claimants? And we might just discuss that. So that's the structure. So let's start with the idea of justice, the hypothetical, to get us moving. Now, I want you to imagine, and I should say this hypothetical, as I say, comes entirely from Sen's book, The Idea of Justice. Now, there's a flute that three people claim. These people are geographically remote from one another, so only one of them can get the flute. And the question is, who would you give it to and why? On what basis? What theory of justice? What idea of justice would ground your decision? Now, Anna says, I should have the flute because of the three, I'm the only one who will ever be able to play it. I've learned to play the flute. I know how to play it. The others will never be able to use it for the purpose for which it was created. Bobby's claim is fundamentally very different. Bobby has had a life of great poverty up till now. The other two have a comfortable existence, Anna and Claire. Bobby has never had a toy before. The flute has come into his hands innocently, without any wrong on his part, and he's formed a deeper emotional attachment to it. It's become for him a treasure, an emotional support. Claire's claim is very different. She says, I'm entitled to that flute because I made it with my own hands. And just as I finished it, someone came in and took it away from me without any authority. It was stolen, if you like. Without any, and it's in the hands now of the decision maker. I should have it because I made it. Okay, who should get it? That's our question. When we go through these hypotheticals, when we go through the different conceptions of justice, think about which one might apply, if at all, to those three claims. Mac, if you could go on to the next slide. Now, there's a lot of, I wonder if we can just spend a few minutes talking about some justice issues that you see as pressing in Australia, in contemporary Australia. Now, Mac or Crystal, if we'll keep a note, and of course, I'll be listening intently. We just want to list some issues, things that you think are very important justice issues for us in Australian society at the moment. The floor is over to you.
Yeah, feel free to put your microphone on, everyone, or if you'd like to put something in the chat as well.
Molly's just put up treatment of refugees and asylum seekers. Thanks, Molly.
Inquiry into ministerial conduct.
Equal access to justice and equal positive treatment from Rafaela. Yeah, open justice from Max. And I'm sorry, I missed that oral contribution, sorry.
I just said inquiry into ministerial conduct, like Christian Porter and everything.
Exactly, yes. So yes, the responsibility of politicians and in particular ministers. Conduct standards. Disability, societal injustices towards disability groups. Thanks, Rafaela. Women's rights and equality from EKE.
Another one is high incarceration rates amongst the Indigenous community in Australia. Despite being a smaller segment of the population, the percentage for incarceration is much higher.
It's an important one. Thank you. Thank you. Any others that people want to nominate at the moment? Well, the animal welfare laws from Davina, thank you. Yes. These are important issues, and I think it's very helpful to get some sense of the issues on your mind so that we can, when I say we, I mean the program, I'm no longer the program, you can actually respond to those. So that's been very helpful. Keep putting them in on the chat site, but maybe, Mac, we could go on to the next slide, and I'll start my presentation in relation to different theories of justice. Thank you. Look, I want to start with the first one, utilitarianism, or sometimes called consequentialism, looking to the consequences of action of a decision or of a resource allocation that goes to the greatest happiness or the greatest number. But before I do so, could I point to, on the screen there, you'll see a couple of books. I want to refer in particular to Michael Sandel. Michael Sandel's book, Justice, What's the Right Thing to Do? It's now 11, 12 years old. Is a terrific book, a terrific introduction to the idea of justice, different theories of justice, and I've drawn upon that today in this presentation. Emeritus sends, and I should also say, Sandel teaches at Harvard University. He has a very famous course which is available online to students there. His lectures on the notion of justice. If you've got time to dip into that, you'll find it very, very stimulating and very helpful. He's subsequently written a couple of other books, recently on, most recently, I think, on meritocracy and the claims of meritocracy as a foundation for justice, as a spurious notion, of a spurious proxy for justice. His concern is really around whether equal opportunity is sufficient. And there's also, before that, a very significant book about the limits to markets as determinants, as indicators of just outcomes, of reflecting human preferences. Amartya Sen's book, The Idea of Justice, I've referred to already. It's a bit more complex, but it's really a very important book. The other writer I draw attention to will come up in a later slide, American philosopher John Rawls. His book, A Theory of Justice in 1971, has made a very important contribution, and he's revised it subsequently. Rawls is a very important thinker. So these are three writers that I'd particularly commend to you. Sandel is a terrific, accessible, easy writer, and I think he's both in his books but also in his lectures is a very good starting point. Now, let's go to utilitarianism. Many of you will know this already, perhaps from previous studies, but I'm not going to assume that there's been a great depth of prior knowledge. Utilitarianism says, look, a just outcome for a decision maker, whether it's a parliament, a lawmaker, is that, or policy setter, is that we look to consequences. The morality of action, the justice of a resource distribution depends on its consequences. What outcome will produce the greatest aggregate happiness, the greatest aggregate benefit or utility within the community that's affected by that decision? And that goes back to Jeremy Bentham. It goes back to Mill. It's a very old notion, a very important one. Look to the consequence of the decision and see whether it makes more people happy, whether it in aggregate satisfies community preferences maximally. The difficulty I pose, I was picking up a couple of difficulties of that. People have got differing preferences for happiness, and is there a common currency, a common coinage of value that enables calculation? We might think of that by reference to the claims in a moment in relation to the flute, when we come back to that hypothetical. How do you measure happiness? How do you measure utility on that aggregate notion? And also it excludes other things from the calculus, the mathematics, the arithmetic, if you like, of calculating aggregate value. What it leaves out are intangibles, which many would argue, and I would certainly be amongst them, that tangibles such as a sense of social solidarity, a sense of our responsibility for each other, a concept we'll come back to. And it also leaves out, it also raises the question, which is fundamental to utilitarianism, what about individual rights? I put there in the little line there that probably mustn't make a lot of sense. May the majority resume Colosseum entertainments. Now, by that I mean, do you recall the Roman Colosseum? There was a bit of the entertainment, bread and circuses are all around, for example, sending minorities, typically Christians, to be eaten by lions, or gladiatorial contests. But in a sense, a better example is the notion of universal human rights. Are there some rights that ought to be protected? Individual rights, civil and political rights, even economic, social and cultural rights that ought to stand against the majority, that the majority isn't sovereign in relation to everything. So that's there's some problems with utilitarianism, but it's a notion that has a long and proud lineage. Mac, if I could trouble you to move to the next one, please. Now, second conception is justice. The just outcome is that which promotes freedom. And of course, it's a notion that is fundamental to a number of constitutions, perhaps most commonly expressed perhaps in the United States Constitution, that freedom of liberty of action, of thought, of action, of the pursuit of happiness is a fundamental principle that ought to determine whether the justness of particular policy settings or decisions. One form of that, and perhaps the most popular one, is libertarianism, that markets alone allow the satisfaction of wants. Through markets we express the depth of our feeling towards a particular course of action, a particular product, a particular commodity. And markets play a role in allocating, weighing up the aggregate satisfaction so that they best satisfy human wants. That just leave it to the market, and in a sense that will work out the aggregate preference. Adam Smith famously called it the light on the hill. The market, the invisible hand of a market will guide us towards the best satisfaction of our community, individual wants within a particular community. Now, of course, this negates a role for government. Ronald Reagan famously said, government isn't the solution, government is the problem. And that sentiment, of course, has had an ascendancy, particularly in the last 3 decades under economic globalization, where governments have stepped back from the regulation of economic activity in particular, as boundaries between states disappeared under an economy which became increasingly global. What's been very interesting, of course, in the last year and a half has been, under the influence of COVID, the crisis, government coming back into action and in fact playing a very significant role, and not leaving to markets alone, but relying upon markets, for example, for the production and generation of vaccines. So there's a more complex, subtle play between government and business, government and regulation and markets. But that thinking has changed a little, somewhat, I think, thinking within communities and within governments themselves. And of course, it's also always a very excessively narrow view. The famous speech that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the 4 Freedoms speech in 1941, he spoke about the 4 fundamental freedoms: the freedom of speech, freedom of belief, but also the freedom from want and the freedom from fear. And those last 2 freedoms are collective freedoms, freedoms that that depend upon a role for social solidarity, but also for government regulation. Now, I also want to pick up, but not at the great expense of your time, Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative. Kant is a great, we would say, German philosopher, probably was Prussian philosopher in Königsberg in the east coast of Prussia, as it then was, as now I think within one of the Baltic states. He spoke about, really true freedom is a different kind of freedom. It's a freedom that comes from within and is given by our decision to act not from a kind of external inclination, from thirst or from hunger or other, bodily appetites, but from our own exercise of internal freedom. It's conditioned upon a concern for the motive of our action, not the consequence, but the moral worth of our action. Motive confers a moral worth. You do something because it is right. Therefore, the woman or the man for whom honesty is the best policy, this is not his phrase, is not an honest man. The motive is false. And he says, and he looks towards what might be a universal law that would determine freedom, the real exercise of freedom. And he says, act on the maxim, act on the rule that you would accept as a universal rule applicable to everyone. And fundamentally, he says, under that maxim, you would treat people as ends in themselves, not as means to another purpose, another objective, but ends with an absolute value, not a relative value. and of course, and an absolute value and a dignity. And of course, the notion of universal human, this is the foundation of universal human rights, where that everybody has a dignity which is equal and absolute. And it does not depend upon the exercise of, it overrides state action or the exercise of majority. Only when we act under these three notions of motive, universal law, treating people as ends, do we act freely. Of course, I'm not a Kantian scholar, and this is not the time really to pursue that more fully. But it's another concept of freedom, and it's one that grounded another theory of justice, which, Mac, if you would be kind enough, we'll move on to on the next slide. Now, justice is fairness and equality. I spoke about John Rawls, the great American philosopher. He was concerned about, what would be a just society look like if we came together to frame a just society, but separated from our particular status, our particular place within the existing society. What would that look like? And he spoke about a social contract for a just society drawn up behind a veil of ignorance, where we wouldn't know how we would be placed under that society. So we would have to kind of take a chance, and we would want, therefore, assume a measure of equality. And he says such a social contract, such an idea of justice would be one that provides equal and basic liberties for everybody, of speech and belief, and those liberties would prevail over the tyranny of the majority. But it would permit inequality, but only such social and economic inequalities that would work to the advantage of the least well-off member of society, for the poorest. So you would ask yourself, is paying somebody, a doctor, a lawyer, or, whatever it is, a politician, a higher amount, is that going to actually improve the position of the poor rather than under a regime of strict equality? And he would say, yes, doctors need to be, and lawyers perhaps need to be paid more to encourage them to go through legal studies and medical studies. The concern is to avoid moral arbitrariness, the advantages of opportunity and natural endowment, of being born in a particular country, in a family or in a situation with personal gifts that you can pursue with a generation, with social capital that comes from of a variety of kinds. These gifts, including the personal ones, really should be exercised only for the common good. Now, the objections to that are obvious. Why would anyone get out of bed in a situation? What's the incentive to act? If you can just go back 1 second. What's the incentive to exercise, to effort, to act? For a drug company to find a vaccine so quickly. But of course, it's got a consensual foundation, albeit one that's presumed. Mac, if you could move on, please. That's the justice as fairness and equality. Now, justice is the promotion of virtue. This is a complicated one. It's complicated because it moves, we can state it simply, its roots lie in Aristotle. A just society is one that promotes the virtue of its citizens, that develops their human capacities and potential. And really, laws should be such a rule of life that will make citizens good and just. That's the purpose of a law. That's the purpose of a policy. It's about promoting human virtue and the goodness and the justice of action of the individuals. And if you look at you can test the justice of an action, or a decision, a policy decision, by its purpose. What's its purpose? What's its goal? What's its end, or he would say its telos? Is it for the promotion of virtue, or of a culture of justice, a culture of goodness, or at the individual level, the virtue of individual citizens in their own human capacities and their capacities for flourishing? Now, it's interesting just to think about that, about the flute hypothetical. What can you see? How might that apply to the problem that we've got? Now, Kant and Rawls say this virtue norm really doesn't take us very far. A just society surely will permit of each of us to choose our own conception of how we want to live. What is the good life? We've all got different conceptions of how life should be lived, how we want to live and how we think our fellow citizens should live. But of course, in a sense, that raises another conception of justice, which I'd call a fifth one, which melds into a kind of a communitarianism. It says, is that individualism that Kant and Rawls, is it taking you back into a kind of a utilitarianism? Does it really reflect the reality of our lives? That there are two different conceptions of our lives. We are individuals acting atomistically in a society in which we don't we pursue our own conception. We're individuals bouncing around. We pursue our own conception of the good life, and we do it by a series of contracts, arrangements, etc. Another view, which is more, the sociologist Emile Durkheim over a century ago spoke about lives. We don't live like that. Our lives are all embedded in a society. They're embedded in a culture. They're embedded in the communities in which we live, from which we are descended. We're socially embedded, is the reality of our lives. We inherit a history and an identity. We inherit moral obligations of solidarity and of loyalty and responsibility to each other. From a family, beyond that into a network of friendship, of relationships within a country. Now, you're probably too young to know Johnny Farnham, and this famous song "Sadie the Cleaning Lady," but which launched a career. But he had another song, his name I don't remember, but he says, "We're all someone's daughter, we're all someone's son." In a sense, we're shaped by families, we're shaped by tribe, we're shaped by an identity we've inherited. That may be the countries from which we've come from or our parents have come from, to which we hold allegiance. Maybe our belief structures, maybe our sporting connections, a whole host of things. We live richly embedded lives. Now, I think that's a conception of another conception of justice that sees us as socially embedded in a community with obligations of solidarity that come from that. And Mac, if you could just move on to the next one, we'll just explore that and some limitations. Look, we as a family, we feel, I think, obligations of special responsibility to family members relative to strangers. I think it's just part of the reality of obligations of care, of support. We prioritize family first. It's an impulse that is very difficult. Now, Sandra talks about the limits of family solidarity, and there, you probably don't, none of you would know about the examples he gives, but there was a particular nasty thug, I've forgotten his nickname, Sandy Bulger, operating up in the United States, up in the Northeast, I think in Massachusetts. His criminal history was just appalling. And he went hiding, but his brother was a legislator in the Massachusetts Parliament, Congress, and his brother turned him in because simply Bulger was actually, his criminality was unaffected. And the Unabomber one, again, the Unabomber was a very interesting a man who had very strong views that probably many people here on this call would share about social justice, but he pursued those views by sending incendiary devices through the mail, and he lived a hermit's life, and he promised at one stage that he would stop doing that if the New York Times published on the front, on its opening pages, a lengthy text, a program of civil action and civil reform. His brother turned him in. I suppose they're just examples of limits of family loyalty, very difficult, painful ones. His brother turned him in because he just recognized in the New York Times article the writing style. And then there's the apology for stolen generations in Australia. This is, the difference taken between John Howard and Kevin Rudd. Do those of us living in Australia now, who might have his family may only have 1 or 2 generations of connection to the country, and who are not Indigenous, do they have a personal responsibility for past wrongs. What is that? Do we have a collective, a personal as well as a collective responsibility? And in particular, do we even have a collective responsibility? And the different views taken in relation to that. We didn't perpetrate the stolen generation's past wrongs, but nonetheless, is there a degree of collective guilt and responsibility in relation to those? If only perhaps because one derives benefits from that past action. And the claims of patriotism. Should we buy Australian products? What if, in fact, an alternative product comes from a country where levels of poverty are far greater than our own? What are the moral claims of buying Australia? I suppose buying Australian, prioritising Australian products. What's the significance of this conception? I suppose it leads to a communitarian idea of justice, which, that we cultivate social solidarity. That we recognise that our lives are not just individuals, atomistic individual lives, but they're lives that have a degree of social embeddedness. We cultivate, and therefore, and that means to cultivate a social solidarity and a sense of mutual responsibility. I have to say the Brennan Justice and Leadership Program is that. Inequality undermines social inequality that would undermine that social solidarity through dividing life experience and opportunities. And of course, one implication is maybe we need a culture of robust public engagement on moral disagreement. We shouldn't be driving discussions of morality and justice from the public square. This is part of a sense of community and the engagement that comes from the community. Now, look, I think that's all I really want to say in relation to those different theories of justice. It's a very inadequate one. But it's meant to open up a discussion. And I just wonder if we could just go on back to the next slide, which I think is the last. And it takes us back to where we started, the idea of justice. Who are you going to give that flute to and why? And do any of these theories help you make that decision? I wonder whether people want to, should we just take Anna's situation? What's the basis for what would the basis for Anna's claim be, do you think? If you go through those theories, I don't know whether, Mac, maybe you would just want to, do you remember the facts? She's the only one who'll ever be able to play the flute. Mac, if you perhaps run through through some of those slides again. The question is, can you source more flutes? No, and the answer is no. This is just one particular flute. Yes, that would be lovely if someone could come in and give a flute to all three, but there's only one. Please, please feel free to unmute and come in. So, I see, right. So Max has said, arguably, Anna's cause depends upon a utilitarianism, that she will get the greatest happiness from the flute. Is that, Max? Do you want to unmute and develop that?
Yep. Hello, Paul.
Hi.
Personally, I'd probably go with Claire, just in terms of the flute wouldn't exist to begin with, and therefore we wouldn't end up with the other ideas to consider. But if I was to argue for Claire, I'd say that while there was one other party that would get happiness from owning the flute outright, even if they couldn't play it, I feel that in this situation, if Claire was to use the flute with her ability to perform, that would outweigh in terms of like the utilization of the flute would produce the most useful happiness from the flute, as opposed to it just being an object owned by one party.
Yeah, look, that's very clear and helpful. Thank you. Look, I wonder, should we stop sharing the screen so we can just see each other? That'd be good. Yeah, and feel free to come in. But if you want to go back to the screen to look at the slides again, just let me know. Yeah, so we'll just stay with Claire. Sorry, with Anna first. Okay, that's utilitarianism. Does anyone see an objection to the utilitarian argument in this situation? Take a view against Max's position.
I guess you could argue that happiness is quite a subjective thing, so you can't exactly measure who would get the most happiness because it just means different things to different people.
Exactly. That's exactly that. There's no currency of happiness. And who would be another? Who's the other person who might say my utility needs to be counted, my happiness needs to be counted here? I suppose it's both of them, but is that the problem? Bobby's is certainly clear, isn't it? It's an emotional attachment, and you're saying we don't know. How do you weigh Bobby's against Claire's, against Anna's happiness? There's no common currency. The coinage is different.
I'll just put that back on so everyone can have another look.
That's is that one objection? How do you measure different elements of happiness? And is there another argument that might be made for Anna? That's a problem, isn't it, with the utilitarian calculus? The maths aren't the same. You've got apples and oranges. You're weighing one against the other in terms of how do you actually do the mathematics, do the math? What's another argument from different theories of justice? Anna's performance may bring others happiness as well, says Mariam. That's right. That's part of the calculus. Anything else? Any others? Just staying with the utilitarian, the calculus. Are these parties the only three in existence, or is there a third party? Says Max. No, I think there'll be others who adhere it. Family members, Anna's family member, maybe Anna would perform. It would be used for an audience.
Adding on to that, I think maybe it's arguable that you can take the happiness perspective and put it to Claire's benefit, because then her playing it could bring happiness to others through hearing the music. So it's the happiness of the greater community as opposed to one person. That's sort of just trying to think of alternate arguments.
Yeah. Well, and Claire has the pride of she made the flute, so she has the pride of ownership of, if she had it, she would have the pride of the pleasure would come from having the fruits of her own labor with her and to be enjoyed even if she couldn't play it. The joy of the creator. What's another kind of theory of justice that Anna might invoke?
I was looking at promotion of virtue in the sense of that kind of collective social connection, and has the idea that, that form of justice would promote Anna's potential as a flute player, enabling her to have flute will, I guess, in the words used on the slide, make citizens good and just. The purpose of giving Anna the flute is so he can play it, I guess. And along with utilitarianism, that can extend to others and increase the aggregate happiness.
Yep. That's a nice That's a nice invoking of the two different arguments. Yes. Is there another way of looking at the virtue argument in relation to a flute? Can you say a flute has a virtue? Can you say it has an end? What is its end? What's its telos? What's the purpose for which it was created?
It's a musical instrument, so it was created to be played, and I guess that could be compared to Bobby. Rather than being played with, it is not really a toy. It is, I guess, a musical instrument, so that's the perspective.
Yeah, I think that's a strong argument that the purpose of a flute, the end, its ground of action, was that it is to be used. It's a musical instrument. It's not a toy. So Anna would invoke those two theories. Should we go on to Bobby? What's the basis for Bobby's claim in terms of these theories of justice? Who would he invoke? Bearing in mind that Anna and Claire are both people who are comfortable.
I think for me, Paul, it might be number 3, and John Rawls' theory of the social contract, that, you know, everyone should have this equal and basic opportunity. And I guess because Bobby hasn't had the enjoyment of a toy or instrument before, this might, I guess, even the playing field and create greater sort of equality for all.
Yeah, it would address a significant inequality between the three, in that he has never had a toy before. He's been in poverty, abject poverty, and this would restore some measure of fairness and equality between the three claimants and improve his position. That would be the argument. Is that right? Anyone want to pick that argument up and either develop it or look at its limitations? It's a difficult one, because this is, these theories of justice are meant to operate essentially as questions at a societal level, rather than the level of individual claimants. So there's a little bit of distortion when you apply it to a purely personal, individual hypothetical like this. It's not a great shift in inequality, in addressing the problem of inequality, but it moves in that direction. And for Bobby, it has a very significant impact, his deep emotional attachment to that particular flute.
And I think, yeah, would it, Molly, were you going to say something?
Oh, I was just going to kind of contribute to that based on what Paul and Mac have said, just that, yeah, it wouldn't make a substantial difference compared to maybe a stimulus check or a Centrelink benefit from the government. But if Claire and Anna possibly, or more likely I would say, have other toys or objects or other parts of their life that could keep them occupied, and maybe they will discard the flute after a while. Anna will get bored maybe, or Claire will just kind of display it and forget about it and let it collect dust, whereas Bobby does have that attachment, and there's no reason to believe that later on in life Bobby could not actually learn how to play the flute.
Yep, thank you. That's good. That's good. Of course, we don't know what the age of Anna and Bobby and Claire are. We assume they're young. I've taken the hypothetical as it's from the book itself. We assume they're people who are a bit younger than you are, and maybe they're not all the same age, but certainly that attachment's there. How do we know Bobby will like the flute, even if he just believes? Well, we know that Bobby does like it, that he loves it. He's come to form a deep emotional attachment to it. Do people want to move on to Claire's claim? How would you, if you're the advocate for Claire, you're appearing for Claire before this tribunal, how would you frame her claim on the basis of justice? Raffaella, you're posted there. Do you want to talk to your post? Anyone want to come in, unmute and?
Well,
yep.
Yeah, Raffaella or Maximilian, if any of you would like to. Yeah, Maximilian.
So I'd just say, instead of, for example, we've been looking a lot into utilitarianism for the other options, I'd say that the taking of a flute away from Claire is a reduction in happiness in one party for a gross or an increase overall in gross happiness. However, I wouldn't see that as fair under something like a more egalitarian model. I'd probably argue that as the creator of the flute wouldn't exist without Claire to begin with, and we wouldn't even be having the argument of where the flute should go if it wasn't created. So at the very least, there should be a compensation to Claire, or she should have the right to hold on to it.
That's good. No, thank you. Look, and that's thanks, Max. That's I suppose the notion of compensation is one that And perhaps that is the solution, but it's not. It's not one of the options that comes out. We assume that probably isn't the. I've got. There's some comments on scrolling down. I think Rafaela can't come on orally. But she can't unmute. But she's written here just to object to. I feel like we should ask Claire as well what her purpose is. Because only she knows. I'm sorry, I'm scrolling down a bit more. Only she only knows she knows really. Of course, it is intrinsically not a toy. However, only Claire would really know. So. What would be? Does Claire's claim depend upon her purpose? What do you think? How would you? Of those theories, which one? I know it's not transparent, but I think one of them could be invoked more readily than the others. What's the base? Putting it without reference to the theories. What's the basis for Claire's claim? It is that she made the flute. It's the work of her hands. It's the product of her effort. Wouldn't both a Marxist and a right-wing a right-wing politician say that she therefore has a significant moral claim? Could you not put that on just on the libertarian grounds, that this is the product of her own work, of her own effort and achievement, that she's made it? It's part of her fundamental liberty to enjoy the fruits of her own labour. Now, to deny her the fruits of her labour would be to weaken the incentives to produce. She should be entitled to those fruits. But what's missing? Would there be one other matter that you would think about? One other question you would ask that would go to that question, might answer that. What don't we know about Claire's work with the flute? What don't we know? That that if we knew the answer to it, it would strengthen Claire's claim considerably on these libertarian grounds.
Her motive was for making the flute, because under libertarianism, promotion of freedom, the motive, not the consequence, confers moral worth.
Yes. Well, that's right. So the motive in that sense would that's particularly under a Kantian view, wouldn't it? Yes, the pure freedom. If her motive was to produce something of value, of purpose that might be used as a flute rather than as a toy, that would certainly count. So in that sense, who owned the materials from which the flute was made? Would it matter that Claire owned those materials? Or that they were owned by somebody else, and she simply received the materials, which, in respect of which ownership hadn't transferred, and from them she made the flute? Would that affect her claim on libertarian grounds or on any other grounds?
I think it would, simply because the creation of the flute was a collective response. And that it's more than simply her choice, Claire's choice, because she made it. It would be up to, maybe more than one person.
Yep.
Got a few more comments coming in.
Yeah, Mac, do you want to outline, pick up comments that?
Yeah, I think Hugh has an interesting point. He said that the question then becomes, when do collective social rights override individual rights? What if this wasn't a flute but medicine?
Yeah,
I think it's quite interesting.
Yeah. And that's of course been a part of the story of COVID, hasn't it? To what extent do you seek to protect those who are most vulnerable in aged care facilities and elsewhere, even at the cost by clamping down on the liberties of other people, the extents of lockdowns, most particularly in Victoria? that's been a clear conflict between collective interests and the interests of a particular subset of the collectivity.
And yeah, and then Rafaela has said, you know, perhaps Claire was commissioned for this flute, that perhaps ownership has already been granted, which I guess comes to the question of equality as well. Yeah, like you were saying, is this flute going to be in a gift shop, or is this flute, you know, it's taken a year to make and it's for one person in mind? Who's entitled to it?
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a very good point. We know nothing about the circumstances in which she made it.
I think Max had a question. Max, if you'd like to ask,
yep.
Yeah, go for it.
Cool. Sorry, this is a bit outside the hypothetical, but Paul, I just wanted to get your opinion in terms of these different justice systems as they relate to, for example, different countries of different population sizes and socioeconomic statuses. Would you say that different systems could be utilized at different levels and would have like a different overall utility? For example, maybe if it's a more impoverished country, they don't have the luxury to process or do things through a system which would be fairer to every party, and that a more utilitarian system would overall end up leading to the most prosperous growth of the society.
Yeah, well, clearly different countries have different traditions that shape the balance between the individual rights and the focus upon the collectivity. That's the fundamental difference between, I suppose, you know, Western systems with its individual, particularly those that have a very strong individualistic philosophy, of which the United States is perhaps the obvious paradigm, and those that come from command economies where the focus, of which the Soviet Union was perhaps again a modern paradigm, command economies where the focus is nominally upon the collective, and they see in Eastern formal terms. They're different traditions. India stands as a nice example in the sense that India has a very strong collective tradition in policy and decision making, but is also a very strong tradition of reflecting, you know, of stressing and paying homage to individual and political rights, civil and political rights. A good expression of it is in the in the principal instruments under the human rights instruments under the United Nations. The Universal Declaration of Civil and Political Rights in 1948, adopted by the United Nations, has both civil and political rights, which are essentially concerned with the rights of individuals, to freedom of speech, freedom to belief, equality of treatment, but also as economic and social and cultural rights. And that was a non-binding declaration of principle, but it needed to be expressed in other instruments of universal human rights. And the two principal ones that grew from that were the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Now, the United States, for example, has never adopted the latter one. Its focus has been exclusively upon the implementation of both the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Australia has ratified both, but the implementation has been fuller in relation to the former, the civil and political rights, than the economic, social and cultural. And generally, Western democracies are more modest in their implementation of the economic, social and cultural rights. So there are different traditions. Which one is best is essentially a matter for individual countries. And to state a personal preference, I'd rather not do it at this time. And obviously, I suppose I would feel a sense that we need to be concerned with economic and social rights, a sense of social solidarity, and a sense of development of that particular covenant and the rights under it. It's worth having a look at the work of the special rapporteur I forget his current title, Philip Alston, an Australian who is now based in New York, but he's doing extraordinarily good work in relation to poverty. That in a sense, the economic right against poverty, to ground certain certain protections against extreme poverty. And he's made some wonderful reports, very influential figure. I think, in a sense, that goes down, that body of covenants, that covenant, economic, social, and cultural rights, is grounded in more of a communitarian than an individualistic conception. And I think it's tracking different countries' ratifications, and their degree of development of each, implementation of each, is a way of marking these two different conceptions between libertarianism on the one hand and a communitarian model on the other. And of course, it runs through the number of your courses. When you do corporate law, for example, you'll talk about this issue will come up in talking about what's the responsibility of corporations. Do they have a responsibility towards society, or is it just to shareholders to maximize profit and shareholder wealth? These questions are essentially legal in their decision. And of course, in human rights law, they're richly embedded. But I think, Max, I'm not sure I've given you a satisfactory answer, but I hope I've given you one that's opened up, the issue of the balance between the two. Of course, the other comment to make simply is every country has its own path. It's dependent upon its past path, its past identity, its past traditions, and culture. We're all embedded in our own culture. Our culture in Australia is quite specific to particular things. Look, I think I should hush there, though, Mac, and give you back the floor.
No, that was great, Paul. I think it's just hit 2 p.m. So I think we'll have to wrap it up there, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for all those great questions. And for using the chat so well. And also thank you, Paul, for your time, knowledge, and expertise this afternoon. I know personally this is the second time I've attended the What is Justice talk, and I think the second time I've definitely got even more out of it. So thank you very much. And I just wanted to remind everyone that we have another Justice talk coming up soon. It's with the Honourable Justice Anne Ainsley Wallace, a judge of the Appeals Division of the Family Court of Australia and an adjunct professor at UTS. I'm just going to put the link to the event in the chat box. It's going to be in the Great Hall, so it'll be an in-person event, and you'll be able to ask questions on the night as well in person, which I think will be really great. But yeah, please sign up if you'd like. I think it'll be a really worthwhile opportunity.
Look, Mac, can I just add, she is tremendous. She's a great speaker. This talk will change your thinking about what you want to do. Come. I've heard her speak to students before. She's one of the best speakers we've had in 11 years of the Brennan program, and she really does have an impact. She's got something to say, not just about the family court. She probably won't even mention family law, but she'll talk about being a lawyer, about being a law student, what it means, and what you can get from it. It will actually change your thinking dramatically. Tell your friends to come too.
Yeah, and it'll be in person as well, which will be a really nice experience. We're going to have microphones set up on the night, so you'll be able to walk up and ask a question if you like as well. All right. Well, thank you everyone so much for coming. We really appreciate it. And yeah, I hope to see a few of you around campus and at the next Justice Talk event soon.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.